example of the devastating effects of oil pollution. Well, my next guest is the author of Why We Hate the Oil Companies, straight talk from an energy insider. He is the former president of Shell Oil, John Hofmeister, and he joins me now from Houston. And for independence sake, and certainly for transparency, I have to let people know that, John, you left Shell, of course, in 2008. But I want to, and the footage that you saw from Christian there was 2009. I do, though, want to read you part of a recent Amnesty report on the situation in the Niger Delta. A group of independent environmental and oil experts visiting the Niger Delta in 2006 put the figure for oil spilled onshore and offshore at 9 to 13 million barrels of oil over the past 50 years. I calculate that to about 546 million gallons. That's something like a Gulf of Mexico spill every year for the past 50 years. You were in the business. You certainly worked for Shell while much of that oil was being spilled. Your thoughts?
Well, one of the problems that Shell has had for decades are criminal gangs coming into the Niger Delta, cutting holes in crude oil pipelines in order to steal oil at the dark of night or when no one is around. They fill their barges with stolen oil, stolen from the government of Nigeria, I might point out, and then when they pull away their barge, they leave the crude oil continuing to pour out of the pipe over and over again. I personally witnessed criminals stealing a Christmas tree sitting on top of a well, that when that Christmas tree was removed, the well a day later erupted and led to hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil spewing into the sky all over the earth, which was precipitated by criminals.
All right, I get that. There is no wonder, though, that you had the material to write a book, quote, Why We Hate the Oil Companies. Spills in Nigeria get little or no coverage, certainly nothing like the coverage that that we are getting out of the Gulf of Mexico. Why is that, John?
Well, I think it's largely because they have a very different setup in terms of who's responsible. In other words, the oil companies in Nigeria are partners with the National Nigerian Petroleum Corporation. So the independent majors who work there are working at the pleasure of the state oil company. And I think the state oil company takes a little different approach to working with the media than is obviously taking place here in the United States.
Right, so they're hiding it from the rest of the world, effectively. In an article in the Guardian newspaper, I think in the past couple of days, you wrote that BP must endure, it must get past its fears, because it makes an important contribution to America. Will BP and companies like Shell, for example, be allowed to continue to effectively run Washington going forward? The administration's in hock to them, aren't they?
Well, I think it's very important that companies in America, particularly foreign-owned companies, be very, very careful about how they engage in the political process. When I was president of Shell, there were no corporate political contributions at all. None. Nada. It is important to maintain a distinct distance from what people might interpret as American companies participating in the political process versus foreign-owned companies. I was very careful about that. I can't speak for BP, but I'm sure they are very careful about it as well, because the risks are just too high to try to be a participant in the political process when you're owned by a foreign-owned company.
Briefly, what does BP do next?
Well, they have got to control that flow. If they can't stop it, they have got to control it. The American people, the American government, the society that they're a part of over here really cannot afford to watch that gushing oil just be pouring into the Gulf of Mexico. And so they need to leave no stone unturned, and I'm sure they have every good intention of doing exactly that, but what they have done to date hasn't worked. We really have to find out what led to the blowout, because I think now that they've shut down all drilling in the Gulf of Mexico in deep water, that's a serious mistake for the president to have decided that. Because we don't know what led to that blowout, but I'll bet you we will end up with human factors, not equipment, not machines, not processes, not failure to inspect, but I believe it will be human judgments that come out in the end to be at blame for the flow.
John Hofmeister is a former president of Shell, talking Nigeria and Gulf of Mexico with us this evening. John, we do appreciate your time. Let's get you to another story. We are focusing